I have spent the last several hours reviewing something that every major Western news desk is actively misframing, and the misframing is not accidental. It is structural. What is being sold to the public as a ceasefire breakthrough, as diplomatic progress, as a shared victory for peace brokered on the eve of the Trump-Xi summit, is in operational reality something far more consequential and far more troubling. I am looking at the diplomatic cables, the energy flow data, the UN Security Council draft language, and the timing architecture of Abbas Araghchi's visit to Beijing. And what the sequencing of these events reveals is not a peace deal. It is a pressure execution. Beijing did not come to the table to help Iran. Beijing came to the table to manage Iran. And there is a critical difference between those two postures that nobody in the mainstream press is pausing long enough to explain. The narrative being fed to the public is that China, acting as a responsible global power, leveraged its relationship with Tehran to bring Iran back from the brink and reopen the Strait of Hormuz ahead of the May 14th Trump-Xi summit. That narrative is incomplete in ways that will cost you if you do not understand the full geometry of what just happened. Washington did not win a concession. Washington revealed the ceiling of its own coercive power, and Beijing is now the entity holding the key to every door that comes after this. Step back from the bilateral optics of the Beijing meeting entirely and examine the physical and geopolitical architecture that made this moment inevitable. The Strait of Hormuz is a maritime choke point 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest navigable corridor, flanked to the north by Iranian-controlled coastline and to the south by the Omani peninsula of Musandam. Through this single passage flows approximately 20% of the world's entire oil and liquefied natural gas supply. That concentration of critical energy infrastructure inside a geographically confined space creates a structural leverage dynamic that no amount of naval firepower can fully neutralize without imposing costs that are politically unacceptable to the power attempting interdiction. Iran understood this. Iranian strategic planners have spent decades studying the asymmetric physics of this choke point, how elevation on the northern shore creates firing envelopes for anti-ship systems that compress engagement timelines to seconds, how naval minefields in shallow, confined waters require weeks of minesweeping operations to clear, how fast attack swarm doctrine can saturate the point defense architecture of a carrier strike group operating inside a restricted maritime battlespace. But the geography that matters most to understanding this ceasefire trap is not just the water. It is the energy pipeline that runs from the Gulf through the Indian Ocean and into the refineries of eastern China. Beijing's entire manufacturing economy, the engine that funds China's military modernization, its Belt and Road infrastructure projection, and its yuan internationalization strategy, runs on Gulf hydrocarbons. When Iran restricted Hormuz transit, the shockwave did not stop at Washington. It traveled east. It hit Chinese import costs. It hit Chinese refinery throughput. It hit the quarterly growth projections of the world's second-largest economy at a moment when Beijing needs internal stability to manage its own structural economic pressures. This is the terrain that nobody is mapping accurately. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a pressure point on the United States. It is a pressure point on China. And China, unlike the United States, has a direct, non-negotiable dependency on keeping that waterway open that cannot be hedged through strategic petroleum reserves or domestic shale production. China's refinery infrastructure on its eastern seaboard is specifically calibrated for Gulf crude grades, the heavy sulfurous blends that flow from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran. Substituting alternative crude sources at scale requires refinery retooling that takes years, not weeks. Beijing's energy security calculus is therefore structurally binary in a way that Washington's is not. The strait opens, or the Chinese industrial economy begins to degrade. That is not a negotiating position. That is a physics constraint. Beijing acted not because it was persuaded by Washington. Beijing acted because its own economic self-interest demanded it. Now examine the precise mechanics of how Beijing executed this intervention and why the word ceasefire is a strategic euphemism for what actually occurred. When Wang Yi opened his meeting with Araghchi on May 6th and declared that a comprehensive ceasefire brooks no delay and that a resumption of hostilities is inadvisable, he was not issuing a diplomatic request. He was delivering a structured ultimatum, calibrated to give Iran exactly enough face-saving language to comply without appearing to capitulate. This is how Beijing operates at the highest levels of coercive diplomacy. The pressure is absolute, the language is multilateral, and the target state exits the encounter believing it made a sovereign choice. Araghchi arrived in Beijing carrying Tehran's core demand: reassurance that China would continue absorbing Iranian oil exports, continue blocking punitive UN resolutions, and continue providing the economic oxygen that kept the Islamic Republic functional under maximum US pressure. Beijing's response was conditional. China signaled it would maintain its diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council, where it had already vetoed multiple attempts to formally condemn Iran's actions in the Strait, but only within a framework that did not permanently destabilize the global energy corridors on which China's economy depends. Understand the operational sequence clearly. The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio publicly urged China to press Iran to ease its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent followed by publicly calling on Beijing to use its influence with Tehran to de-escalate the crisis. When a global superpower's senior cabinet officials are publicly asking a rival power to manage a third country on their behalf, that is not diplomacy from strength. That is a revealed preference, a public acknowledgement that the coercive instrument Washington deployed, the sanction, has hit a sovereign ceiling it cannot breach unilaterally. Beijing read that signal with precision. The leverage instrument Beijing deployed was Iran's own existential dependency. China buys the vast majority of Iran's oil exports, often at prices discounted significantly below world market rates. Iranian revenues are largely cycled back through the purchase of Chinese goods, Chinese infrastructure investment, and Chinese financial services. The 25-year strategic partnership agreement signed in 2021 formalized this dependency architecture, creating an institutional framework that functions as a sanctions immunity treaty, but one whose terms are set entirely in Beijing, not Tehran. When China instructs its state-adjacent enterprises to ignore U.S. Treasury sanctions on Iranian oil purchases, it is not doing so as an act of solidarity. It is doing so because Iranian oil at discount prices is economically advantageous and because maintaining Tehran's financial viability keeps a critical regional counterweight to U.S. influence operational. But that calculus has a hard limit. When Iranian actions begin costing China more than Iranian dependency is worth, in energy disruption, in trade route instability, in diplomatic friction with Washington that threatens the broader trade relationship, Beijing recalibrates. U.S. Pentagon intelligence analysts had reportedly assessed that China was weighing whether to transfer advanced radar systems and air defense platforms to Tehran, a move that would have meaningfully complicated U.S. and Israeli strike planning by closing critical sensor gaps. The fact that this transfer has not been confirmed as executed tells you exactly where Beijing drew its operational red line. China extended enough support to keep Iran viable. It withheld enough to keep Iran manageable. And it timed its intervention to occur precisely when Washington needed a diplomatic win ahead of the May 14th Trump-Xi summit, creating a situation where both Trump and Xi could present the ceasefire as a product of their bilateral relationship, extracting maximum diplomatic credit from a pressure campaign that Beijing itself engineered. The macroeconomic consequences of this ceasefire architecture are not abstract. They are already moving through the global system and will land in household energy costs, portfolio valuations, and sovereign debt dynamics within the next 2 quarters. The maritime insurance market repriced Gulf transit risk to war zone levels the moment Iranian Hormuz restrictions began generating operational uncertainty for commercial shipping operators. War risk premium spikes do not move in percentages. They move in multiples, and they do not reverse quickly when hostilities pause. Insurance underwriters require sustained operational stability over months, not days, before they reduce war risk classifications. That means the cost of moving every barrel of oil, every liquefied natural gas cargo, every container ship transiting the Gulf will remain elevated well beyond the diplomatic moment of this ceasefire announcement. The U.S. drafted UN resolution, supported by allied Gulf states, and revised specifically in its language to secure Chinese and Russian acquiescence, calls for guaranteed safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, an end to Iranian attacks on commercial shipping, removal of sea mines, and cessation of Iranian transit fee collection. The fact that this resolution required revision to attract Beijing's support is itself the most important data point in this entire episode. Washington did not write that UN language and then present it to China. Washington wrote it, received Chinese objections, revised it, and resubmitted. That sequencing means the United States is now drafting its own multilateral legal frameworks with Chinese veto requirements built into the drafting process. That is a structural shift in the architecture of international law enforcement, and it has not appeared in a single front-page headline. Each of those demands carries an implementation timeline measured in weeks to months. Sea mine clearance operations in the confined, shallow waters of the Hormuz approaches require systematic minesweeping protocols that cannot be accelerated without creating new navigational hazards. The global oil market is not pricing a clean resolution. It is pricing a managed ambiguity, and managed ambiguity in a choke point that carries 1/5 of global energy supply is a structural inflation input that no central bank monetary policy tool can neutralize. For macro investors watching dollar-denominated oil settlement architecture, the deeper consequence of this episode is the accelerating legitimization of yuan-priced Iranian crude as a transactional norm. Every barrel of Iranian oil that clears through yuan-denominated bilateral arrangements rather than SWIFT-connected dollar channels is a data point in the demarginalization dataset that sovereign wealth funds in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Kuala Lumpur are now actively studying. Saudi Arabia has conducted exploratory yuan-settled oil transactions. The UAE is deepening financial integration with Chinese clearing infrastructure. Pakistan has publicly called on Beijing to assume a larger mediation role across regional tensions. The petrodollar system's resilience has historically rested on the absence of a credible alternative settlement mechanism at scale. Beijing is constructing that alternative, not through confrontation, but through parallel infrastructure that does not require Washington's permission to function. The Hormuz ceasefire is not a resolution of this structural dynamic. It is a pause inside it. I want to be direct with you about the strategic trap that is now fully set, and why the word ceasefire in this context should alarm rather than reassure every serious geopolitical analyst watching this situation. Washington faces a binary that has no clean exit. The first path is to treat the ceasefire as a genuine diplomatic opening, press forward at the Trump-Xi summit for a broader framework that includes verifiable Iranian nuclear constraints and permanent Hormuz access guarantees, and quietly deprioritize sanctions enforcement on Chinese firms absorbing Iranian oil in exchange for Beijing's continued pressure on Tehran. The cost of that path is precedent. Every sanctioned regime on Earth, from Pyongyang to Moscow to Caracas, now has empirical evidence that a sufficiently large trading partner can make American sanctions structurally unenforceable. The second path is to use the diplomatic breathing room of the ceasefire to rebuild enforcement architecture, accelerate secondary sanctions on Chinese intermediaries, and push for a UN resolution framework that binds Beijing to verifiable compliance mechanisms. The cost of that path is escalation. Beijing concludes that Washington is using Iranian oil as a proxy front in a broader containment campaign against Chinese energy security. withdraws its cooperative posture on the UN resolution, and the global economy absorbs a second, longer Hormuz disruption that no Western central bank has the tools to manage. Neither path leads to a clean outcome. The ceasefire that the world is celebrating this week is not the end of this crisis. It is the moment when the real negotiation, the one between Washington and Beijing over who controls the price of oil, the currency it is settled in, and the military architecture that defends the corridors it flows through, formally begins. I want your tactical read on this. If you were the senior strategic advisor walking into that Trump-Xi meeting on May 14th, which path do you recommend? And what is your red line? Put your assessment in the comments. The sharpest analysis gets featured in tomorrow's briefing. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Tomorrow, we go deeper into the mind-clearing timelines, the insurance market data, and the 3 signals in the UN draft resolution language that tell you exactly where this is heading before the summit even starts.